This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here's your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for tuning in this special edition of NC Spin. Everything else about 2020 has been strange, so we wanted to try to put things in perspective. This show is going to take a look at North Carolina yesterday, today, and tomorrow. We're fortunate to have a special panel to help us in getting that perspective, so let's introduce them to you. We begin with Mike Walden, who is the William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor of Economics at NC State University. Jim LeLoudis, who is an Associate Dean of Honors and a History Professor at UNC in Chapel Hill and Director of the James Johnson Center for Graduate Excellence. And they're joined by, as usual, John Hood, Syndicated columnist and author, and Chris Fitzsimon, Director of the state's Newsroom. We're going to begin our uninterrupted discussion after these brief messages from our underwriters.
Farmville, steeped in Eastern Carolina tradition, yet surprisingly sophisticated. In Farmville, find a French bakery, a furniture school, glass blowing, great shops, and restaurants. East of I-95, in the middle of everything, find it first in Farmville.
In more than 21 years on NC Spin, I never endorsed a product or sponsor, but I volunteered to do this message for family physicians. Over the past 40 years, my family doctor could quickly diagnose my illnesses because he knew my medical history. Evidence suggests I'll live longer, have a higher quality of life, and save 33% on health care costs. I believe in my trusted relationship with my family physician.
Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Your life is more flexible and efficient than ever, and your energy is too. See how North Carolina's electric cooperatives are building a brighter future for the rural communities we serve at ncelectriccooperatives.com/brighter.
Let's begin the spin. I'd like for us to focus our comments on this show on the period BC, before COVID, WC, with COVID, and AC, after COVID. So much for the acronyms. Let's get started. Jim LeLoudis, North Carolina's history has experienced many significant events. I'm thinking about Civil War, Reconstruction, the 1918 Spanish flu, the Great Depression, and prior to March of this year, where would you say we were historically?
Well, Tom, you decided to start with the easy question first, right?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, I think I'll take you up on where you started that. I would go back to 1868, in the middle of Reconstruction, and the rather extraordinary election that happened that year. In that election, a new biracial alliance of former slaves and white allies formed within the state's newly established Republican Party, won 107 of 120 seats in a constitutional convention called at the instruction of Congress to draft a new constitution that would bring North Carolina back into the Union. And the document they produced was remarkable. It guaranteed free elections. It afforded every adult male citizen the right to vote. It did away with property requirements for running for high office in North Carolina. And it, for the first time in this state's history, created a system of elected rather than appointed county government. I mean, what they were framing there was a radically inclusive and democratic vision of the state's future, but it didn't last.
Right, the fusion government, yeah.
Yeah, and it was challenged by opponents, and this went on over a period of 35 years, actually, following Reconstruction, challenged that vision, and wanted to restore a political and economic order in which power and wealth were concentrated in the hands of the few. And they talked in ways that we're familiar with today, with appeals to issues of voter fraud and corruption, much of it couched in thinly veiled, more often than not explicit racial appeals. And the consequences for this state were profound and tragic.
So bring us up to where we were in January, February, and March. How would you describe us then?
All right, so this is, the beginning of what we know as the system of Jim Crow and blacks and second-class citizenship, great poverty for the state overall. In some ways, you could think of it as a bad movie that runs again and again. And I think in some ways, on the edge of the pandemic, we were in one of those sequels. And in some respects, the pandemic really laid bare the issues that were at stake.
That's a very good frankly, I was wondering where you were going there and how long it was going to take to get there, but you did a good job of getting me there. Thank you. Mike, let's look at a similar progression economically. At various times in history, we've been known as the Rip Van Winkle state because of our sluggish economy, also as the Dixie Dynamo. We were hard hit during the Great Recession of 2008. How would you describe our economy prior to March of this year?
Very good. BC, very, very good. All the metrics for the state look very well. Unemployment under 4%. We had a growth rate a little under the national average, but a growth rate that was good. In fact, we had been the longest period of time in our history since a previous recession, and then all that collapsed with the advent of COVID. We have suffered through COVID similarly to the nation. Big drop in the second quarter. We think we're going to have a big rebound in the third quarter. We don't have those numbers yet.
Yeah, I'll get there in a minute.
I think we're in a recovery now, but it's slowing.
Politically, John, we've always been a pretty conservative state politically. We went through a period in the 60s with Terry Sanford and then with Jim Hunt and so forth like that, where we became a little bit more progressive. Where would you say we were politically prior to this election?
North Carolina was and certainly was in early 2020 a center-right state, a state where many more people would identify themselves as conservatives than as progressives, but also a state that was changing demographically and politically. It wasn't that long ago when the Republicans first rose into a competitive position in North Carolina, which really only started in the 70s. Its strength was actually in urban areas and some mountain counties that had always been Republican, but it was really urban areas, suburban communities where the Republicans had a lot of strength. They struggled to win in the rural areas that were still Democratic. Well, obviously that situation prior to COVID had already begun to change. It began to change even before the Trump phenomenon. And now what we have is a closely divided electorate where either party can win most state offices. And in fact, we saw this year that some voters will split their tickets between them still.
And we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Y'all are trying to get ahead of me here. Chris, so far as it goes, John alluded to the fact that we've had great population increases, at least 100,000 per year. Where are these people coming from, and how had they changed North Carolina on March 1st?
Well, they're coming from all over the United States, and we continue to be one of the faster growing states in the country. They're coming to our urban areas, increasingly our suburban areas. I think Professor LeLoudis hit on a great word to think about, though. We were before COVID, we were living through the sequel of sort of precariousness where the COVID exposed all these faults that were already there along racial and economic lines. Even though the economy is doing well, as Dr. Walden says, there's a big swath of North Carolina that wasn't doing well. Largely African American, but also poor white, struggling white families who are sort of ripe for the populism that has sort of invaded our country. And the last point I'll make is where we were pre-COVID is the coalition I think the Republican Party has made with sort of the more extreme elements. I've talked often on this show, whether it was the Tea Party movement, the nullification rallies at the legislature, all this stuff was sort of underneath, and Republicans were holding it at arm's edge, and Donald Trump has sort of brought it into the mainstream. And I think that's why in North Carolina and across the country now we're really struggling with how our democracy rolls on after this tumultuous time.
Mike, in March of this year, our unemployment rate was 4.4%. We had come through the Great Recession. We were making nice recovery in North Carolina. In fact, I think you'd been on our show not too long ago talking about we were into this recovery prior to the beginning of COVID, right?
That's right. We had, again, done very, very well in the years between the Great Recession and the start of COVID. When I did your show a year ago, I was talking about 2020 being another growth year, setting more records. And COVID has set us back. I don't think it's set us back necessarily in terms of our fundamentals. I think North Carolina is going to come out of this looking to be what I would call a safe state. I think we could benefit from being a state that, yes, has a range of locations from density to low density. I think we can attract businesses and people from some of the regions that have really suffered, like the Northeast. I've been told by state officials that we continue to get calls from businesses. We had some very good announcements the other day. I do think the key in the future is going to be we're going to have a massive retraining effort. The jobs that were lost all aren't coming back. We're going to have a different set of jobs, and I think we need to think very hard about how are we going to retrain workers. And I think a lot of that's going to be done by businesses, apprenticeships, certificates, et cetera.
Yeah, you guys want to keep taking me to North Carolina tomorrow. Let's focus on yesterday. Historically, Jim, would you say that that history will say that North Carolina had resolved many of its problems? I know that you've written a book about race, and we're going to talk about it in a little while. But would you say we've resolved many of our problems, or that there were fundamentally still history problems that were nagging us?
Yeah, I wish that I could say that we have resolved them. I mean, certainly things are better today than they were in 1960. But, even in terms of the recovery pre-COVID, I think it's important to recognize the degree to which that was quite uneven. It was still the case that we had counties in this state in which up to 40% of children lived in poverty. And right before the pandemic, I think we all remember, several years ago, that study that pointed out that Charlotte had the lowest social mobility rate of any metro area in the United States.
Moving up economically.
Yeah, moving up if you were born into poverty. So yes, I mean, the state's made great advances. There's no denying that, but there are still deep-rooted problems that derive from our history that remain very much in front of us.
All right, well, let's move into North Carolina today. Going into this year, we believed the big story was going to be the election. Who knew? Prior to March, nobody knew anything about coronavirus or COVID-19. After recording our first cases in early March, our state, like the rest of the world, changed. Jim, perhaps it's trite, but we've never seen anything like this before. Staying home, virtual work, learning, work and learning, shopping and travel. How's history going to record our reaction to COVID-19?
Well, I guess I'll keep up my bad movie metaphor. We've been through this once before. It was in 1918, 1919, the Spanish flu pandemic. And what's interesting there is the parallels. There was an anti-mask movement. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, never said one word in public about the flu. We were in a war. He worried that it would be a sign of weakness. And the pandemic developed in exactly the same way. A relatively mild, at least in terms of what was about to come, outbreak in like May to July, and then an absolute whirlwind of death between September and December. Before it was over, about a fifth of all North Carolinians had gotten the flu. About 14,000 died. And the racial disparities were almost exactly the same as they are today.
Mike,
that piece of it's pretty sobering.
Mike, as we've talked about, the economy was staging a recovery from the Great Recession, then things shut down. Where are we economically today?
Well, I think we are in a recovery. I mean, technically, we don't have the numbers for North Carolina for the third quarter, but I think you can look at job numbers. We've been steadily increasing. We had the big gains in the late summer. The gains have narrowed. I think right now I would expect to see growth continue, but I am worried about the surge right now, probably slowing things down. But I think we're past the worst, and the question now is how long will it take to get back to where we were pre-COVID? And what kind of permanent changes that will occur.
John, you've written some about this in some of your columns. North Carolina has changed. We've changed from the standpoint of family gatherings, so far as work, so far as shopping. Many of the traditional activities we've enjoyed have changed. Would you agree that so far as it goes, whether these changes have been good or bad, they've made an impact and possibly will go forward?
They've certainly made an impact. They have been largely negative, but not entirely negative. as Mike was alluding to, there's a lot of question marks now about how much of this is a temporary phenomenon that people will gladly put behind them in the rearview mirror as they race forward. Things they were going to do in May, they'll do next spring, that sort of thing. Or are some of these changes, in the case of the workplace and commuting patterns and education, are some of these changes lasting? One of the biggest differences between pre-COVID and the COVID experience we're now in is traffic. There's simply a lot less traffic in our metropolitan areas. Now, on the one hand, if you are out driving, this is delightful. On the other hand, it tells you something about not just that people are staying at home and doing work from home, they are, but there is somewhat less activity happening than there was before. I think that is largely a fleeting phenomenon, but some of these things will probably become permanent.
I was going to say, you get on our 4-lane roads like 70 and 95 and 40 and so forth like that, there's a lot of traffic. But I do think, Chris, we can agree that everybody would like to put this behind us. Looking, however, at government, and that's something we talk quite a bit about on NC Spin, our governments have really experienced some phenomenon that are unusual to us. For one thing, we had really stark differences between the legislature and the governor during this crisis. Would you agree?
Well, I would agree, but I think it reflects sort of our national division about. I think there is a strong argument to be made that the economy was never going to recover until we got control of the virus. I think nobody thought we could stay sort of sequestered in our home the entire time, but there's just a lot of data sets that have shown recently that states that had mask mandates early on, for example, have done better than states that have had no restrictions at all. But masks had to deal with this, all became a political football. Maybe that was to be expected in a political year, but I don't think it did us a service as a community. And I also think it's hard to talk about any of these issues in the abstract. And I know we're a North Carolina show, but we have no national leadership at all that helped unify the country and bring us together. In fact, it polarized us further in North Carolina. It made it much more difficult for politicians on both sides to talk plainly to people about what was expected, how we could help, how government could help. It's really been a frustrating experience to watch our state ripped in half.
Mike, is there any economic sector that either suffered more than another or benefited more than another from this virus?
Well, I think technology is going to benefit, has benefited, and will continue to benefit because of things like what we're doing right now. In terms of suffering, certainly businesses and sectors that rely a lot on in-person contact, tourism, restaurants, hospitality, et cetera. I think those are going to fundamentally change, probably fewer people in them. And finally, if we see remote working really take off, think of what's going to happen to office complexes and offices, the janitors, the secretarial staff, the surrounding restaurants that feed those folks during noon. They're going to suffer immensely.
Jim, how is history going to record North Carolina's reaction to the elections, what we did in the elections?
Yeah, well, I mean, in part, I'd go back to some things that, Chris had said. Look, I mean, we're a deeply divided state, and we've always been a purple state. I mean, that's what's interesting about North Carolina history, and it's only taken the smallest margins to move us one direction or the other. That's why issues around voting rights end up being so critical here. I think in terms of the history of the way we've dealt with this particular moment, I'm afraid the judgment's not going to be very complimentary. I learned in 8th grade civics that government's role was to protect the general welfare, and whether we're looking at the national level or state level, it's really disturbing. Almost 500,000 North Carolinians without health insurance when we went into this, tens of thousands more today. One of the food banks my wife and I support, we got an update yesterday, 15,000, 7.5 tons of food in 1 week. What kind of society, tolerates that?
Yeah.
It's a real call to think about what we believe in this country and our obligations.
Fascinating discussions, guys, but we got about 6 minutes left in show, and I want to get to North Carolina tomorrow. We've talked about leading up to COVID, the time since COVID. Now we want you to tell us what to expect. Mike Walden, what can economically we expect for 20 and 21 and perhaps beyond?
I think growth, I think it'll be a year or two before we get our major metrics back to where they were pre-COVID. I think North Carolina competitively will be looking very well, very good. I think we'll continue to attract businesses and people, but particularly in the job area, massive changes, massive overhaul about where people work, what kind of skills they need. I think that's what I would point to and say we need the most focus on.
Mike, we're gonna be having these vaccines coming online mid-year, late spring, early mid-year for people. How's that going to affect us economically?
Well, we actually may benefit in North Carolina through some production increases. We have a pharmaceutical sector here. We have a manufacturing sector, so just in that. But obviously, tremendous optimism. I think we'll see a big jump in the stock market, for example. But it won't cure these underlying changes that I'm emphasizing. Those are still going to go on, and that I think is what we really need to worry about.
So, Jim LeLoudis, let's examine what we can expect from North Carolina post-pandemic. We're going to have a new administration in Washington. We're going to have leadership in North Carolina, which is still going to see a governor of one party, a legislature run by another one. What can we expect so far as the atmosphere politically in North Carolina?
Well, I'd like to be optimistic. So let me go in that direction. I mean, I hope that we can come together across the political divisions to do three things. Look at the turnout in this election. One extraordinary affirmation of democracy. I hope that we can put more effort in making it easier for people to vote rather than more difficult for people to vote. I hope that we'll take gerrymandering seriously. Yes, historically it's been done by both parties. That's no excuse. We really need to find a way to ensure that all North Carolinians have an opportunity to elect people who represent their community interests and values.
Jim,
and then third, I hope we'll find some big ideas for evening out that kind of
a great vision for our state. We'd like to see a great vision, right? Yeah. Excellent point, Chris. Jim talked about gerrymandering. We're going to get the results from the 2020 census, albeit we don't think that they did a great job of measuring who we were in North Carolina. Is this legislature going to get more serious about redistricting reform and ending gerrymandering?
Well, I'd like to say yes, but I'm not sure that that's going to happen this time. It's really hard to ask people in power to give up that power, and drawing the maps is the ultimate political power. But the Republican State House several years ago passed a redistricting reform effort. The Senate has been loath to take it up. I hope that public pressure will at least figure out some criteria that we can use this year that people perceive as fair. The long-term goal, I think, is some independent body, as happens in Iowa and some other places. We need to stop letting politicians choose their voters, but voters have to speak out and demand that happens.
And so far as the elections, we had expected maybe we might hear something from that, but I'm not sure that we did. John, the biggest function of state government is education. Let's talk a little bit about what we can expect educationally. We've seen a big shift away from district or traditional North Carolina schools to charters and private schools. Our universities have gone through a tremendous upheaval in having the COVID on campus. What do you expect university-wise and public education-wise?
I think the COVID experience simply accelerated to some extent trends that were already occurring. There was already an increased amount of school choice in North Carolina. That will continue. Most students will still go to district-run public schools, but that percentage will be 70% or 65 or something eventually, not 85 or 90. And as far as universities are concerned, there was already increased use of distance learning, online coursework for students who were on campus. That will probably continue, but lots of students are dissatisfied with their online courses.
Well,
and so
in
when
fact,
that happens,
in Wake County, they reported that 25% of all the students that did online learning the first part of the year flunked at least one course.
That's right. I mean, in the college context, some students like it, some students like it some. We are not going to have, full spread, permanent virtual education for most students. That's not what they want. But additional amounts of coursework online, that's a permanent change.
We could have this conversation. This has been fascinating. I thank you all for participating in it. And we could talk for hours. Unfortunately, we have 25 minutes and 26 seconds. I do want to note before we leave that both of our guests today are noted authors. and have been recognized for the work that they've done. And I want to review and recognize some of their latest books. First of all, let me talk about Jim LeLoudis' new book, Fragile Democracy. Jim, I've ordered it. I'm looking forward to it. It's the struggle over race and voting rights in North Carolina. Where can we get it? Amazon, your local bookstore?
Amazon, your local bookstore, direct from UNC Press at a 40% discount.
Oh, 40% discount. I wish you'd have told me before that. Mike Walden, you've written 2 new books. I'm really intrigued about this. The first one is Real Solutions, Common Sense Ideas for Solving Our Economy and Pressing Problems, and Disunionia. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Disunia.
Disunia. A political thriller. I don't expect my economist to be writing novels. Amazon
sometimes that side of the brain kicks in. John Hood knows this because we both do this. He writes fiction and nonfiction.
There you go.
I've dabbled in both too.
All right. Well, good. Let's encourage everybody to get it. And folks, we are excited to have had you to join our show this week. Like I say, we've run out of time. But we hope you've enjoyed our post-Thanksgiving show. We hope you'll watch our website, ncspin.com, and stay tuned and watch out for The Spin.
Farmville, steeped in Eastern Carolina tradition, yet surprisingly sophisticated. In Farmville, find a French bakery, a furniture school, glass blowing, great shops, and restaurants. East of I-95, in the middle of everything, find it first in Farmville.
In more than 21 years on NC Spin, I never endorsed a product or sponsor, but I volunteered to do this message for family physicians. Over the past 40 years, my family doctor could quickly diagnose my illnesses because he knew my medical history. Evidence suggests I'll live longer, have a higher quality of life, and save 33% on health care costs. I believe in my trusted relationship with my family physician.
Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Your life is more flexible and efficient than ever, and your energy is too. See how North Carolina's electric cooperatives are building a brighter future for the rural communities we serve at ncelectriccooperatives.com/brighter.
Quality public television is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC TV.